In today's lesson, I want to talk about strategies that are used for rebranding a place. This is part of the A-level OCR spec 5.B, and it's talking about how different strategies can be used both singularly and conjunction to change the meaning of a place as part of rebranding. So I've got some images here of some buildings on the Upper East Side of New York. These are buildings and institutions that have been there for a long time, but they're obviously started to maybe be run down a little bit. One of the strategies that can be used in rebranding is where big corporations come in and actually take over these places. It's what we call a market-led strategy. So the rebranding is led by kind of private investors and companies who want to move into an area to make profits. So the Lismore Hosiery Company is obviously a company that it's probably lost its function and is not making a lot of money, where Subway know that they can come into that building, come into that institution, revamp it and make money by selling sandwiches to the local area. So it's where kind of money is produced by private companies who want to make financial benefits out of an area. And another kind of strategy we might see happen, and this is in the Salford Quays in Manchester, is what we call a top-down approach. So rather than just private companies being the main focus, it would actually come from local government. So that could be a council or a local development agency, and the planning departments that are attached to that, they would make decisions about rebranding an area and make some kind of huge changes in terms of the infrastructure and the type of businesses that were being implemented there. Salford Quays is the example I've used here. This is what it looks like now, but back in the late and early 80s, it was a place where it was a quayside, so it was there for shipping, but it lost its business because containerization came in and the docks therefore got closed, deindustrialised happened, so there was a lot of derelict land, and the council bought it and they started revamping the area. And it's actually gone from an area that was a dockside, and it's now an area that is seen as the kind of hub of the media industry in the north of England. So BBC and ITV are huge employers there. And because of those companies have gone there, that's attracted other media companies to go there to use their facilities. And so we have this site called the Media City UK, which is a really, really dominant production house in the TV industry in the north of England. Another example of a strategy that might be used, and again, these are not always used singularly, they can be used in conjunction, is what we call a flagship development. What we'll see here is a football stadium being built, and when we have flagship developments, that's where we have these big one-off projects that are built, and the hope is that will attract further investment and further regeneration around it. Could be a sports stadium, could be an art gallery, could be a museum, something that is large scale, huge investment. The example I've put here is the Millennium Stadium, which was built in Cardiff. Cardiff, again, was one of those areas that's seen big deindustrialisation in South Wales. But the Millennium Stadium was a big project that was supposed to bring in big sporting events, and it held the Rugby World Cup in 1999, and it also has held like the FA Cup final for many, many years when Wembley was being rebuilt. And because of that, it's actually brought in a lot of money. So there it says 1.3 billion, and nearly 1 in 10 jobs that are related to tourism are kind of somehow connected to Millennium Stadium. This is where a big investment has helped the rest of the city by drawing in business, and then other businesses can kind of bounce off that, what we would call the multiplier effect. Similarly to the flagship development, we have something called the legacy strategy. So that is where, rather than just one big building, you have a kind of big event, often related to sport, and then you try and regenerate before that, and then try and kind of build on that legacy afterwards. So I've used the example here of the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. It was lots of the kind of Facilities were built for the Glasgow Games, and also things like the Athletes Village, which since the Games has actually been turned into affordable housing in the East End of Glasgow, which is a really deprived area. So the hope is that by having a big event here, you can then sometimes use some of the facilities afterwards to attract in big events perhaps, but also in this example, maybe use it as a way to kind of actually help out an area. So there's the part of the legacy of this Games is to invest in the East End of Glasgow and make changes to make sure it wasn't just one event and then they forgot about that part of it. They call this as like the legacy, so trying to make sure that they are continuing to develop that area long after the Games are finished. The last one I'm going to talk about is what we call events or theme. So this is pretty much what it says. It's where the rebranding is focused around like a big cultural event or a kind of theme. And I've given the example for both here of Liverpool and Riga, which is in Latvia, of the European Capital of Culture. This is a festival which tries to promote the culture of a city and therefore try to get tourists to come in here and spend money. Associated with that, they will obviously have events held, but also they might use it as opportunities to invest money to kind of build new developments. The Liverpool example is a really good example. In 2008, it was the Capital of Culture, and it actually had nearly 10 million people come to visit the festival, which is 34% higher than they would normally get in a year in terms of people coming to the city. And because of that, people bring money and spend money, and therefore lots of money is brought into the economy. But not only does it bring in money, which could be used in the city, but also it can change the view of a city. So Liverpool was seen as a place that was deprived, high crime rates, had a very bad image. But the Capital of Culture and all the events that were associated with it showed people that it was a place that you could go and visit and have a good time, and it gave the council an excuse to invest money in new developments. So I've put example here is a big retail complex called Liverpool One, which was built to encourage people not only to go to these cultural events but then to spend their money in the retail complex that had been built for them. The last thing I'm just going to highlight is the fact is these aren't just perfect strategies that work and don't have issues. There's some big problems that can be associated with them as well as benefits. I'm just going to focus on the problems for now. So one of the things that can often happen is this idea of gentrification. This is very much the idea where wealthy residents move into a poor area, spend money to improve it in the properties and the businesses, but often that comes at the cost of poor residents who unfortunately are displaced and have to move to another area. It can raise the rent prices, but also it can do this idea in the graphic here, it says colonialism. It can change the culture. So you often get middle class, wealthy white people moving into an area, and they unfortunately move out the poorer people who might be there, who might be of a different ethnicity. There's a really good example of this all over the UK, Brixton being a really good example of a Caribbean community that lived in South London and Brixton for a long time. But unfortunately, lots of wealthy, middle class white people have moved in there, and they are therefore changing the culture. The demography is changing, closing down lots of businesses and replacing them with kind of alternative businesses, which means that kind of diversity of the area starts to change, and unfortunately people can't afford to live there and move out. Another good example of a problem is some of the times these big developments, these big changes can actually not necessarily directly impact or benefit local people. Example I've got here is Liverpool One, which was a great development for the city on a city-wide scale, but unfortunately it was right next to the place we've studied called Topdown, and very few people had the skill set to actually work in many of these jobs, and therefore they're not actually benefiting it. So tourists come in here, get a great opportunity to spend money, but unfortunately it doesn't actually provide any really significant amount of jobs. Also, lots of those profits aren't staying in those cities. They're not staying in Liverpool companies. You can even see in the bottom there is Zara. So lots of that money will actually go to the head office of Zara, which is not likely to be in Liverpool. So we can see there are many benefits to these strategies, but it's not a uniform thing, and we can have big problems depending on the strategy that's taken.